The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The young prince had always been fascinated by the ceremonial guards who stood at attention throughout the palace grounds, their red uniforms and tall black hats creating an impressive sight that never failed to capture his imagination. On this particular Tuesday morning, George noticed something different about one of the guards stationed near the main entrance. The man stood perfectly still as always, but there was something in his eyes that seemed sad, almost distant. George had developed a keen eye for reading people's emotions, a skill his mother Catherine had been teaching him as part of understanding his future role. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though George didn't know this yet. James had been serving the royal family for 15 years, standing watch through countless ceremonies, state visits, and quiet family moments. He had watched Prince George grow from a toddler, taking his first wobbly steps in the palace gardens, to the confident young boy he was today. What Prince George couldn't see was the letter tucked safely in James's jacket pocket. It was his retirement notice, carefully written the night before after much consideration. At 55, James had decided it was time to step down from his duties and spend more time with his own grandchildren, whom he barely knew due to his demanding schedule. As George and the Queen continued their morning walk, the young prince kept glancing back at the guard. There was something about the man's posture, the way he held his shoulders, that reminded George of his own grandfather when he was feeling thoughtful or melancholy. The prince had inherited his grandfather's sensitivity to others' emotions, and he could sense that this guard was carrying some kind of burden. The Queen noticed her grandson's distraction and followed his gaze to the guard. She had known James for many years and had always appreciated his dedication and professionalism. Elizabeth had an extraordinary memory for the people who served her family, and she remembered James's children's names, his wife's birthday, and even his favorite type of biscuit served during the guard's tea break. George tugged gently on his grandmother's sleeve and whispered something in her ear. The Queen smiled softly and nodded, understanding immediately what her grandson was feeling. She had raised 4 children and helped raise 8 grandchildren, and she recognized the look of genuine concern in George's eyes. James continued to stand at his post, unaware that he had captured the attention of the future king. His mind wandered to his own childhood, growing up in a small village in Yorkshire where his father had worked as a blacksmith. He remembered the day he first put on the Royal Guard uniform, how proud his parents had been, and how honored he felt to serve the crown. The morning continued with its usual routine, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the castle. Prince George couldn't shake the feeling that today was somehow important, though he couldn't quite understand why. He spent the rest of the morning thinking about the guard, wondering what might be troubling him and if there was anything a young prince could do to help. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, James remained at his post, following the strict protocols he had memorized years ago, but deep in his heart, he was preparing for what he knew would be one of his final days wearing the uniform that had defined so much of his adult life. The weight of his decision sat heavy on his shoulders, even as he maintained the perfect posture expected of a royal guard. Later that afternoon, Prince George found himself in the palace library with his tutor, Mrs. Henderson, working on his history lessons. But his mind kept drifting back to the guard he had seen that morning. The thick books about British monarchs and constitutional law seemed less important than the real person standing just outside these walls. Mrs. Henderson noticed the prince's distraction and set down her pen. She had been teaching royal children for over 20 years and understood that sometimes the most valuable lessons came from curiosity rather than textbooks. When George explained what he had observed, she listened carefully, recognizing the compassionate nature that would serve him well as a future king. Meanwhile, James Mitchell was taking his afternoon break in the guards' quarters, a small room beneath the castle where the security staff gathered for meals and brief moments of rest. His fellow guards chatted about weekend plans and family news, but James sat quietly, reading and rereading his retirement letter. Sergeant Williams, James's longtime friend and colleague, noticed his unusual silence. The two men had served together for over a decade, sharing countless shifts and developing the kind of friendship that comes from mutual respect and shared duty. Williams had seen James through difficult times, including when his father passed away 3 years earlier. James finally shared his decision with Williams, explaining that while he loved his service to the royal family, he felt the pull to spend his remaining healthy years with his own family. His daughter had recently given birth to twins, and his son was getting married in the autumn. James wanted to be present for these precious moments instead of watching them from afar through phone calls and brief visits. Williams understood completely, though he felt a deep sadness at the thought of losing such a dedicated colleague. James had been like a mentor to many of the younger guards, always willing to share his knowledge and help them understand the honor and responsibility of their position. Back in the library, Prince George was asking Mrs. Henderson about the guards and their lives. He wanted to know where they came from, whether they had families, and what happened when they grew old. His questions showed a maturity beyond his years, and Mrs. Henderson found herself impressed by his genuine interest in the people who served his family. The tutor explained that many guards came from military backgrounds and saw their service to the crown as a continuation of their duty to the country. She told George about the rigorous training, the long hours, and the pride these men and women took in their work. She also mentioned that, like everyone else, guards eventually retired to enjoy their later years with their loved ones. As the afternoon wore on, James returned to his post for the evening shift. The castle took on a different character in the late afternoon light, with golden rays streaming through the ancient windows and casting intricate patterns on the stone floors. It was during these quiet moments that James often reflected on his years of service and the countless memories he had accumulated. Prince George appeared at one of the library windows that overlooked the courtyard where James stood. The young prince pressed his face against the glass, studying the guard with the same intensity he usually reserved for his favorite books about adventure and exploration. There was something about this particular guard that continued to intrigue him. That evening at dinner, George sat with his parents, Prince William and Catherine, in one of the castle's smaller dining rooms. The family preferred these intimate meals when they could discuss their day and share their thoughts without the formality of state occasions. George found himself telling his parents about the guard who seemed sad, describing what he had observed with remarkable detail. Prince William listened to his son with growing pride. He remembered his own childhood curiosity about the people who worked around the palace, and he was pleased to see that George was developing the same awareness and concern for others. Catherine smiled as she watched her son's animated explanation, recognizing the empathy she had been nurturing in him since he was very young. The next morning brought a crisp autumn breeze that rustled the leaves in the palace gardens. Prince George had barely slept, his mind occupied with thoughts of the guard and a growing desire to somehow help. During breakfast, he asked his parents if he could learn more about the people who worked at the castle, particularly the guards who dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family. Prince William exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine. They had been discussing George's questions from the previous evening, and had come to the same conclusion that their son was ready to understand more about the responsibility that came with his position. William decided to arrange a special tour for George, one that would introduce him to various staff members and help him appreciate their dedication. James Mitchell arrived for his shift that morning with a heavy heart. He had spent the previous evening with his wife, Margaret, discussing their future plans. She had been supportive of his decision to retire, understanding the sacrifice he had made over the years and agreeing that it was time to prioritize their family. Their daughter lived 3 hours away, and they had missed so many important moments with their grandchildren. As James took his position at the main entrance, he noticed unusual activity inside the castle. Staff members were moving about with purpose, preparing for what appeared to be an impromptu event. He had learned over the years to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when something special was planned, though he had no idea that he would soon be part of it. Prince George spent the morning with his father, visiting different departments within the castle. They met with the kitchen staff who prepared meals for both the royal family and the hundreds of employees who worked on the grounds. George was fascinated to learn about the head chef, who had been creating menus for royal events for over 20 years, and the pastry chef who handcrafted desserts for state dinners. They visited the housekeeping department, where George met Mary Thompson, a woman who had been caring for the castle's rooms and furnishings for 30 years. Mary showed George how she restored antique furniture and maintained the precious artworks that decorated the palace walls. The young prince was amazed by her expertise and the love she put into preserving his family's heritage. In the gardens, they met the head groundskeeper, Robert Davies, who had been maintaining the palace grounds for most of his adult life. Robert explained how he planned the seasonal flower displays and cared for the ancient trees that had witnessed centuries of royal history. George was particularly interested in an oak tree that Robert said had been planted during the reign of Queen Victoria. Throughout these encounters, Prince William watched his son carefully. He could see George's genuine interest in each person's story and his growing understanding of how many people worked together to maintain the traditions and dignity of the monarchy. The prince was learning that being royal meant being grateful for and respectful of those who served. As they approached the area where the guards were stationed, George's excitement became visible. He had been looking forward to this part of the tour all morning, hoping to learn more about the man who had captured his attention. Prince William had spoken with the head of security earlier and arranged for a brief introduction to some of the guards. During their break time, James was surprised when Sergeant Williams approached him during the afternoon shift change and asked him to join a small group of guards who would be meeting with Prince William and Prince George. Williams didn't provide many details, simply saying that the prince wanted to thank some of the long-serving staff members for their dedication. As James walked toward the meeting room, his retirement letter seemed to weigh heavier in his pocket. He wondered if this would be an appropriate time to submit it, or if he should wait until after this special occasion. He had always prided himself on his timing and professionalism, and he didn't want to diminish what appeared to be a meaningful moment for the young prince. The meeting room was elegant but comfortable, with large windows overlooking the gardens and portraits of previous monarchs watching from the walls. James found himself in a small group of 5 guards, all of whom had served the royal family for many years. They stood at attention as Prince William and Prince George entered the room, but the atmosphere was warm rather than formal. Prince George's eyes immediately found James among the group. There was something about seeing the guard without his ceremonial hat and in a more relaxed setting that made him seem more human, more approachable. The young prince felt a flutter of nervousness as he realized he was about to meet the person who had been occupying his thoughts for the past 2 days. Prince William began the informal meeting by expressing his gratitude to the guards for their years of dedicated service. He spoke about the importance of their role not just in protecting the royal family, but in maintaining the dignity and traditions that the monarchy represented. His words were sincere and personal, reflecting his genuine appreciation for their commitment. When it came time for introductions, Prince George stepped forward with a confidence that surprised even his father. The young prince had been thinking about what he wanted to say, and his natural curiosity overcame any nervousness he might have felt. He approached each guard individually, shaking hands and asking about their families and their experiences serving the crown. When George reached James Mitchell, something special happened. The guard looked down into the young prince's earnest eyes and saw a depth of understanding that seemed remarkable for someone so young. James introduced himself and mentioned that he had been serving the royal family for 15 years. Watching Prince George grow from a small child into the thoughtful young man standing before him, Prince George surprised everyone, including his father, by asking James if he enjoyed his work and whether it was difficult to be away from his own family. The question came from genuine concern, and James found himself touched by the prince's consideration. He answered honestly, explaining that while he loved serving the crown, he did miss many important moments with his own children and grandchildren. The conversation that followed was unlike anything James had experienced in his years of service. Prince George asked about his grandchildren, wanting to know their ages and what they liked to do. When James mentioned that his grandson was learning to play football, George's face lit up with excitement as he shared his own love for the sport. Prince William watched this exchange with growing amazement. He could see that his son was naturally connecting with James in a way that went beyond the formal protocols usually associated with royal interactions. There was something authentic and meaningful happening between the 10-year-old prince and the veteran guard. As the meeting continued, James found himself sharing more than he had intended. He spoke about his pride in serving the royal family, but also about his dreams of spending more time with his grandchildren and teaching them about the values of service and dedication that had guided his own life. He mentioned his daughter's recent twins and his son's upcoming wedding. Prince George listened intently to every word, his young mind processing not just the information, but the emotions behind James's words. The prince had been raised to understand that leadership meant caring about the people around you, and he was beginning to see how this principle applied to real life. When James mentioned that his grandson was the same age as Prince George and shared his love of football, the prince immediately suggested that perhaps they could meet someday for a game in the palace gardens. The spontaneous invitation surprised everyone in the room, but it came from such a genuine place that no one questioned its appropriateness. James felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Here was the future King of England, showing genuine interest in his family and making a generous offer that demonstrated remarkable kindness. It was in that moment that James realized how much his years of service had meant, not just as a job, but as a contribution to something larger than himself. Prince William could see that something significant was happening and decided to let the conversation continue naturally. He had learned from his own father and grandmother that some of the most important royal moments happened when protocols were relaxed and genuine human connections were allowed to flourish. As the meeting drew to a close, Prince George did something unexpected. He asked his father if he could have a private word with James, explaining that he had something special he wanted to share. Prince William hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, recognizing that his son's instincts in this situation seemed remarkably sound. The other guards stepped away, giving Prince George and James a few moments alone. In the quiet of the elegant room, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the young prince looked up at the veteran guard and spoke from his heart about what he had observed and how it had affected him. James found himself deeply moved by the prince's words and by the realization that his service had been noticed and appreciated in ways he had never imagined. The conversation was brief but profound, creating a connection between two people separated by age, background, and social position, but united by mutual respect and genuine human kindness. During their private conversation, Prince George told James that he had noticed the sadness in his eyes and wanted to know if there was anything troubling him. The directness of the question, coming from someone so young, caught James completely off guard. For a moment he stood there speechless, amazed by the prince's perceptiveness and genuine concern. James found himself opening up to Prince George in a way he never expected. He explained that he had been thinking about retirement, torn between his love for serving the royal family and his desire to spend precious time with his own family. He shared his struggle with the decision, how it felt like choosing between two important parts of his life. Prince George listened with the same intensity he brought to his favorite stories, nodding thoughtfully as James spoke. When the guard finished explaining his dilemma, the young prince was quiet for several moments, clearly thinking carefully about what he had heard. His response demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years. The prince told James that he thought being a good grandfather was just as important as being a good guard, and that his grandchildren needed him in a different way than the royal family did. George explained that while the palace would always have guards to protect them, James's grandchildren would only have one grandfather, and those relationships were irreplaceable. What happened next surprised James even more. Prince George asked if he could write a letter to James's grandchildren, telling them how honored he felt to know their grandfather and how proud they should be of his service. The offer came from such a pure place of kindness that James felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time in years. The young prince continued, explaining that he had learned from his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, about the importance of honoring those who serve, and that he wanted James to know his service would never be forgotten. George spoke about legacy and how James had helped protect not just his family, but the traditions and values that the monarchy represented. James realized in that moment that Prince George had given him something he didn't even know he needed: permission to move forward with his retirement without guilt or regret. The prince's words had transformed his decision from something that felt like abandonment into something that felt like a natural progression, a well-earned reward for years of faithful service. When Prince William rejoined them, he could immediately see that something meaningful had transpired. Both his son and James appeared moved by their conversation, and there was a new energy in the room that spoke of understanding and mutual respect. William felt proud of George's maturity and grateful for James's years of dedication. Prince George asked his father if they could arrange for James to bring his grandchildren to the palace for a visit before his retirement. The request was made with such earnestness that Prince William immediately agreed, recognizing that this gesture would mean more to James than any formal ceremony or official recognition. James was overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer. In all his years of service, he had never imagined that his own family would be welcomed into the palace as guests. The thought of showing his grandchildren where he had worked, of introducing them to Prince George, filled him with a joy he hadn't felt in months. The meeting concluded with arrangements being made for James's family visit and for the letter that Prince George had promised to write. As they prepared to leave, James felt a profound sense of closure about his upcoming retirement. What had begun as a difficult decision weighed down by guilt had transformed into something celebratory and meaningful. Prince William walked with his son back through the palace corridors, discussing what had just happened. He was struck by George's natural empathy and his ability to see beyond the formal roles that people played to the human beings underneath. These were qualities that would serve him well as a future king. That evening, James returned home to his wife Margaret with a completely different energy than he had carried for weeks. He told her about his extraordinary conversation with Prince George and about the upcoming visit to the palace. Margaret was amazed by the story and deeply touched by the young prince's kindness toward her husband. As James submitted his retirement letter the following morning, he did so with a sense of peace and gratitude, rather than the anxiety he had been feeling. Prince George's words had reminded him that his years of service were something to be proud of, and that moving on to the next chapter of his life was not only acceptable, but admirable. The news of James's retirement spread quickly among the palace staff, but instead of sadness, there was a sense of celebration for a colleague who had served with distinction and was now being honored for his dedication. The upcoming family visit had become the talk of the guards' quarters, with everyone excited to meet James's grandchildren and witness this special recognition. The day of James's family visit arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear with golden sunlight illuminating the palace grounds. James had spent the previous evening with his daughter Sarah and son Michael, along with the grandchildren, preparing them for what would surely be the most memorable day of their young lives. 8-year-old Tommy, James's football-loving grandson, could barely contain his excitement at the prospect of meeting Prince George and possibly playing football in the palace gardens. His twin sister Emma, along with baby cousins Lucy and James Jr., would be experiencing the palace that their grandfather had described to them in countless bedtime stories. Prince George had spent considerable time preparing for the visit as well. He had written the promised letter to James's grandchildren, carefully crafting words that would help them understand how special their grandfather was and how much his service had meant to the royal family. The letter was written in his own handwriting and sealed with his personal seal. When the Mitchell family arrived at the palace gates, they were greeted with the same courtesy and respect shown to visiting dignitaries. James, dressed in his civilian clothes but standing with the proud posture of a career serviceman, walked through the entrance he had guarded for so many years, this time as an honored guest with his beloved family. Prince George was waiting in the main reception hall with his parents, practically bouncing with anticipation. When he saw James approaching with his family, the young prince's face broke into a genuine smile that immediately put everyone at ease. The formal atmosphere melted away as George stepped forward to meet each family member personally. The introduction between Prince George and Tommy was particularly special. The two boys, both 8 years old and both passionate about football, connected immediately. Tommy's initial nervousness disappeared when Prince George asked about his favorite team and shared his own love for the sport. Within minutes, they were discussing players and matches like old friends. Prince William and Catherine watched the interactions with warm smiles, pleased to see their son's natural ability to make others feel comfortable and valued. They chatted with James's daughter Sarah and son Michael, learning about their lives and careers while the children played together in the elegant surroundings. The tour of the palace that followed was unlike any other in the building's long history. Prince George personally guided the family through the staterooms, sharing stories about the paintings and furnishings with the enthusiasm of a young boy showing off his favorite toys. James watched with pride as his grandchildren experienced the wonder of the palace where he had spent so many years. In the throne room, Prince George surprised everyone by asking James to sit on one of the ceremonial chairs, while the family gathered around him for photographs. The gesture was simple but profound, symbolically placing James in a position of honor and creating a memory that would be treasured for generations. The highlight of the visit came when they reached the palace gardens. Prince George had arranged for a football to be waiting, and he immediately challenged Tommy to a game. The sight of the future King of England playing football with the guard's grandson, both laughing and running across the pristine lawn, was something that none of the adults would ever forget. James stood watching his grandson play with Prince George and felt a profound sense of completion. All the years of duty, all the missed family dinners and school plays, all the sacrifices he had made suddenly felt worthwhile. His service had not only protected the royal family but had somehow created this magical moment for his own family. Prince George presented his letter to the grandchildren during a quiet moment in the garden pavilion. As James read the letter aloud to the younger children, there wasn't a dry eye among the adults. The prince's words spoke of honor, service, and the pride that comes from dedicating one's life to something greater than oneself. The visit concluded with afternoon tea in one of the palace's smaller dining rooms, where the families sat together as equals, sharing stories and laughter. Prince George asked James to tell the children about some of his experiences as a guard, and James found himself recounting tales that brought the palace's history to life. As the Mitchell family prepared to leave, Prince George made one final gesture that would become the most treasured moment of the entire visit. He presented James with a personally signed photograph of himself, inscribed with words of gratitude for his years of faithful service. But more importantly, he hugged James goodbye, a spontaneous gesture of affection that spoke louder than any formal ceremony could have. The walk back through the palace corridors felt different for James this time. Instead of the weight of responsibility, he felt the lightness of gratitude and the satisfaction of a job well done. His grandchildren chattered excitedly about their adventure, already planning how they would tell their friends about their remarkable day at the palace. James Mitchell's final day as a royal guard arrived with the same autumn crispness that had marked his family's visit to the palace 2 weeks earlier. The past fortnight had been filled with farewell gatherings with colleagues, final briefings with new guards, and the strange but wonderful feeling of anticipation rather than anxiety about the future. The entire palace staff had learned about Prince George's gesture toward James and his family, and the story had become a source of inspiration throughout the castle. Staff members who had never spoken directly with the young prince found themselves impressed by his maturity and kindness, while those who worked closely with the royal family felt proud of the values being instilled in the future king. Prince George had insisted on being present for James's final ceremonial changing of the guard. The young prince had learned that this tradition marked the end of a guard's service, and he wanted to ensure that James's retirement was properly honored. Prince William had arranged for a small ceremony that would recognize James's 15 years of dedicated service. As James put on his red uniform and tall black hat for the final time, he thought about all the changes he had witnessed during his years of service. He had seen Prince George grow from a toddler into a thoughtful young boy, watched the royal family navigate both celebrations and challenges, and been part of countless historic moments that would be remembered long after he was gone. The ceremony took place in the main courtyard where James had stood guard countless times. Members of his unit formed an honor guard, while senior palace officials gathered to witness the formal conclusion of his service. Queen Elizabeth II herself attended, a rare honor that demonstrated the respect James had earned through his years of faithful duty. When Prince George stepped forward to thank James personally, the veteran guard felt the same emotion he had experienced during their first conversation. The young prince spoke clearly and confidently, thanking James for his service and expressing how much their friendship had meant to him. He presented James with a medal of service that bore both the royal seal and Prince George's personal signature. But the most meaningful moment came when Prince George whispered something private to James, words that only the two of them could hear. The guard's eyes filled with tears as he listened to the young prince's final message, a personal note of gratitude and friendship that he would carry with him forever. The formal changing of the guard proceeded with military precision, but there was an emotional undercurrent that made this ceremony different from all the others. As James handed over his responsibilities to the new guard, he did so with the knowledge that his service had been noticed, appreciated, and honored in ways he had never imagined possible. After the ceremony, James walked through the palace corridors one final time, but this walk felt like a celebration rather than an ending. Colleagues who had served alongside him for years offered their congratulations and best wishes, while newer staff members expressed their gratitude for his mentorship and guidance. Prince George appeared beside James as he made his way toward the main entrance, walking with him in comfortable silence. The young prince had learned from his great-grandmother that sometimes the most meaningful gestures were the simplest ones, and his presence during James's final walk spoke volumes about the respect and affection he felt for the retiring guard. At the palace gates, James's family was waiting to accompany him home. His grandchildren, still excited from their palace visit, greeted him with hugs and questions about his final day. Tommy proudly wore a small England football jersey that Prince George had given him, while the other children clutched drawings they had made of their palace adventure. As James walked away from the palace for the last time as a guard, he carried with him not just his personal belongings and official commendations, but something far more valuable: the knowledge that his years of service had touched the life of a future king, and that his own family had been honored and welcomed into the royal family's circle of respect. In the months that followed, James settled into retirement with the peace and satisfaction that Prince George's gesture had given him. He spent his days helping with his grandchildren, teaching Tommy football skills in the local park, and sharing stories about his years of service that always ended with the remarkable kindness shown by a 10-year-old prince. The story of Prince George's compassionate gesture toward James Mitchell became part of palace lore, passed down among staff members as an example of the kind of leadership and humanity that would one day guide the monarchy. For Prince George, the experience had been a valuable lesson in the power of simple kindness and the importance of recognizing the dignity and worth of every person who contributes to something larger than themselves. Years later, when Prince George would face the responsibilities of kingship, he would remember the lesson learned from a retiring guard: that true leadership comes not from commanding others, but from understanding them, valuing their service, and ensuring that their contributions are recognized and honored. The gentle gesture toward James Mitchell had been just the beginning of a lifetime of compassionate leadership that would define Prince George's eventual reign.